The renewed bombing in Gaza cannot be justified. The renewed siege of Gaza cannot be justified. And it is difficult to see how that is compatible. Either of those are compatible with international law. It will be for a court to decide, and there will be a reckoning. The question is, though, is what's going to happen now? Because whatever it is that the British government is doing in the region, it is clearly not working. So the question is, what is Plan B? What is Plan B? Now that the Israeli government has abandoned the fragile course of peace, what is Plan B for the West Bank, which still faces the threat of annexation, and following reports of these strikes, that those strikes may have American endorsement? What is Plan B when it comes to uniting our international allies to make sense of this senseless violation of the peace process? That we need to make sure that it is met not just with words, no matter how passionate and no matter how articulate. We have to do something, and we need to do something internationally and with our allies. Now is the time to stop talking about it and do something.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and to the Minister for the advance sight of this statement. Israel resuming its military campaign in Gaza is heartbreaking for all Palestinians, for the remaining hostages and their families, and for the world. For 2 months, the fragile ceasefire provided space for the release of hostages, and until early March, the flooding of Gaza with vital aid to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians. The resumption of fighting now threatens the lives of both the Israeli hostages, still held in captivity by Hamas, and Palestinians who have already seen their homes and communities devastated by 15 months of war. A new ceasefire must be secured as soon as possible. To this end, what discussions has the Foreign Secretary had with the Israeli government on rapidly recommitting to a ceasefire? Even before the resumption of military operations, the Israeli government had cut aid routes into Gaza, as well as the supply of electricity. This was illegal and wrong, contravening Israel's obligations under international law. In this House on Monday and today, the Foreign Secretary stated that Israel's aid blockade was a breach of international law. Will the Foreign Secretary outline what action he is taking to ensure there are consequences to breaching international law? Hamas must also now immediately and unconditionally release the remaining hostages, the treatment of whom while in captivity has been despicable. We're also deeply concerned by reports that a British bomb disposal expert has been injured and an explosion at a UN facility in the Strip, and our thoughts are with their family. Can the Foreign Secretary also update the House on his safety and condition? Arab states have a vital role to play in supporting the transition back to a state of ceasefire. Their plan to the reconstruction of Gaza also provides a pragmatic proposal for rebuilding the Strip, particularly when compared to the reckless proposals put forward by Trump, who described his intention to remove Palestinians from Gaza. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm that he has engaged closely with Arab partners in the region around their plans for reconstruction? As conflict returns to Gaza, we also need to give Palestinians hope and show them that we support their right to statehood. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the UK must now move to officially recognise a state of Palestine as a vital part of a two-state solution which offers dignity and security to Palestinians and Israelis?
Lynny Ward.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I want to say thank you to the Foreign Secretary for all the work that he and his team are doing behind the scenes on this horrific issue. And I have to say it's quite shocking that the Shadow Foreign Secretary appears unable to say the word Palestinian. And as someone who used to be an international aid worker and was in Gaza, I want to say that the lives of Palestinian aid workers are every bit as valuable as the lives of international aid workers. And more than 170 Palestinian children have been killed this week alone. And yesterday, the Israeli Defence Minister threatened the ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
Question, then I will assist. Please carry on with the question.
Yesterday, the Israeli Defence Minister threatened the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. What action is the Foreign Secretary taking to stop this and to hold the government of Israel accountable for its actions?
Is the point of order absolutely relevant right now? Pretty Patel.
I seek your advice, Madam Deputy Speaker, on just the clarification on the misrepresentation that I have not spoken about the Palestinian Authority in this House at the dispatch box when I have on a number of occasions, Madam Deputy Speaker.
We need to make sure can we please be seated? This is a very sensitive and important debate. We need to make sure that language is tempered and respectful at all times. Our constituents and indeed the world is watching, and we need to make sure that we are not in any way inadvertently misrepresenting each other and our colleagues. But it is noted, but we will now continue. We have a lot of people to get through. Father of the House.
I agree with everything the Foreign Secretary has said, and particularly we have to give hope to the Palestinian people. To be fair to the Israeli government position, Hamas could solve this now if they release the hostages. But having said that, it is surely wrong, would the Foreign Secretary agree that it is quite wrong for anybody in the Israeli government to say that the Gazan people could rise up against Hamas? If you do that, you'll best be tortured or probably killed. The people of Gaza are victims of Hamas as much as anybody. And it is quite wrong for the Israeli government to inflict collective judgment on the people of Gaza. This will bring death, destruction, more radicalism, and will never get the hostages home.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The double standards and injustice we are witnessing on the international stage is truly appalling. It's obvious that Israel is breaking international law, as every serious legal expert on international law has pointed out. And it's shameful, frankly, that the government refuses to state that about Israel, but will rightly do so about Russia's violation in Ukraine. And I say to the Foreign Secretary, the concern and outrage he expresses at the dispatch box is not ending the bloodshed. When will we get the scale of sanctions on Israel that its war crimes demand?
Kit Malthouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been estimated that in the opening salvos of this appalling aggression, the Israelis killed 80 Palestinian children in the space of 51 minutes. There have been reports of children going through amputations without anaesthetics due to the blockade. And of course, it's been reported that leaflets were dropped across Gaza last night threatening extermination. Surely, even for the government, the Israelis have now crossed a monstrous red line. Now, the Foreign Secretary talks about equivalence. I'm assuming that he believes that the Palestinian civilians and their lives are equivalent to the lives of Israeli citizens and also are equivalent to the lives of Ukrainian citizens. This morning, ministers were out on the airwaves offering British troops to keep the peace between Ukraine and Russia. What is it about the Palestinian people that means they're less deserving of that kind of protection?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we all share the Foreign Secretary's shock and anger and frustration at the breakdown of the ceasefire and the deaths that we are seeing in Gaza. And as today's debate shows, words do matter. I want to follow up on the comments from my colleague from Cowdenbeath, given that we are now hearing reports that there are ground activities happening in Gaza led by the Israeli forces. Israel Katz, the Defence Minister, claimed that evacuation of Gaza would resume, and he is threatening the total devastation. These are not the actions of a government that wants peace. They are the actions of an increasingly authoritarian government, more interested in their own political survival than the survival of any innocent civilian, be they Palestinian or Israeli. This is not what the hostage families want to see, and we should speak for them as much for the innocent civilians in Gaza, the Palestinians whose lives are being lost. Can the Foreign Secretary be clear, for avoidance of doubt, that we do not agree with, we condemn the words of Israel Katz, not as they are not going to bring forward the ceasefire, they're not going to uphold international law if they are left unchallenged?
I do condemn those words, and I would ask Minister Katz, who's very experienced, to withdraw them.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The language that we use in this conflict matters. We know what has happened, and the Foreign Secretary has reminded us today. For weeks, supplies of basic goods and electricity have been blocked. So to say that Israel, having done that, risks breaching international law is to say that the position of this country, and this is how it will be heard in Tel Aviv, does not see these acts as a prima facie breach of international law. Is that really the government's position?
The government's position is based on the law that was set out in our export licensing regime, which the honourable gentleman supported in the last Parliament. And the language of that legislation, if he looks at it closely, is that I, as Minister, on behalf of the government, have to make an assessment of clear risk. That is the language that I've used 10 times in this House since September. I stand by it, and so should the honourable gentleman.
Speaker, and I want to thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and his absolute commitment to the end of the fighting in Gaza, to the return of the hostages, and to ultimately a two-state solution. But I do want to say to him that I am contacted by constituents of all backgrounds, of all faiths and none. They stop me in the street and they see the mutilated bodies of babies. They see the consequences of the blockade on humanitarian aid. And they say to me, what is this government doing about it? What am I doing about it? So will he say to my constituents now what action the British government will take in response to Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank?
And let me make clear, when she talks about the horrors in Gaza, she should reassure her constituents that the United Kingdom announced £129 million of funding for the occupied territories just in the last year, and that included 41 million for UNRWA, that we're very clear that humanitarian aid should not be used as a tool, and that, of course, UK support has meant over 500,000 people have received essential humanitarian for the occupied territories just in the last year, and that included 41 million for UNRWA, that we're very clear that humanitarian aid should not be used as a tool, and that, of course, UK support has meant over 500,000 people have received essential health care. 647,000 of them have received food, and 284,000 people have improved access to water, sanitation and hygiene as a result of the British taxpayer. In terms of what we're doing, I've been in this House 25 years. The Honourable Lady knows that this is about diplomacy. It's about diplomacy. I wish that I could switch this off from this dispatch box. She knows full well I can't do that, but what I can do is engage in the issues in detail. It's hard grind. I know this is hard for many in this House, but that is how you bring about a ceasefire.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, mentioned the all-party parliamentary group report on the atrocities committed on the 7th of October 2023, brilliantly researched by Lord Roberts and a whole series of different individuals. This is a document almost 500 pages long, and it contains the evidence of what happened, not only on that day, but also subsequently. I would commend it to the Foreign Secretary to read. In future, this will be the definitive history of what happened on the 7th of October. Could he, therefore, look at the fact that we have 59 hostages still in captivity? It's understood that only 24 are alive, and probably only barely alive if they are, and 35 dead. The reality is there is an opportunity for the deal as proposed by the United States, for a ceasefire to continue, for the release of the hostages, and for Hamas to lay down their arms. That is still open to the terrorists in Hamas to take up. And if they do so, we can then all unite across the House and call for the end of death and destruction.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for mentioning those hostages. The question is now, how do we get those remaining hostages home? And is the action that we've seen in the last 2 to 3 days likely to bring them home, or is it likely to see more of them perish? And I want to stand with the many hostage families who say, can we give the talks a chance to succeed? Because I do think that military action is unlikely to bring them home.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've all been absolutely horrified to see the devastating impact of Israel's military airstrikes, and the Foreign Secretary rightly said it's an appalling and unacceptable loss of life, and that our Labour government opposes the resumption of hostilities. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that there is no military solution to this conflict?
let me state again, there is no military solution to this conflict. It's a conflict that's gone on for 17 months. Had there been a military solution, it would have been found by now. The way forward is a political process and getting back to those ceasefire negotiations.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The inhumanity and the depravity that we witnessed on Tuesday defies belief. But what it does show is that after 17 months, Israel understands fully what impunity is. Because Netanyahu shattered that fragile ceasefire, killing 400 civilians sheltering in tents, mostly babies and toddlers, knowing that there would be absolutely no consequence for his action. So could the Foreign Secretary tell me, can he think of any other conflict at any other point in history when the UK would have accepted one of its closest allies and one of its closest military partners designating babies and toddlers as legitimate military targets?
Can I just say to the honourable gentleman that the whole House will have heard his language. I think the whole House also understands that this is one of the most complex of atrocities. There are atrocities on both sides of this conflict, and I just remind him of the scenes of those murdered horrendously on October the 7th. What we need now is more light and less heat.
Matthew Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This ceasefire must be desperately salvaged for the 59 hostages who they and their families have lived through hell for 530 days now, but also for the innocent people of Gaza who need aid and need safety and security and themselves have lived through hell through that time. Hamas, I worry, they state they want to repeat the actions of October 7th. They are committed only to endless war. What can this government do to ensure they have no role in the future of Gaza?
Well, let me say to the honourable gentleman that reports have come in that Hamas has now started firing rockets into Israel, and sirens are at this time sounding in Tel Aviv. I condemn Hamas's rocket attacks, and I want to reiterate that the only way through this is to get back to a ceasefire. It's unacceptable that Israeli civilians are running for cover and Palestinian civilians are finding that the casualties are rising. There can be no place for Hamas in the future of Gaza, and that's why we're doing everything to help the reform of the Palestinian Authority, and we believe that they must play a role in Gaza's governance in the months and years ahead.
Desmond Swain.
Despite a huge investment in our relationship with Israel over so many years, we appear to be reduced to the position of spectators on a touchline, shouting at the players and being largely ignored. To what extent does the Secretary of State believe, if any, that our lack of leverage is a consequence of policy decisions taken in Washington?
Well, I think it's clear that the efforts of US Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump did bring us to a place where we'd got a ceasefire. And I might say that it sometimes can feel futile. Diplomacy can feel very hard. The words of parliamentarians can feel like they had no effect. But everything that every single one of us as members of Parliament did in those 17 months also led to that ceasefire in January. We wish we could have brought it about sooner, and now we must act to get back to that ceasefire as quickly as possible.
Warren de Just.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is obvious that by us saying that we strongly oppose hostilities and that we are appalled by Israel's action is having absolutely no effect on Netanyahu, who said at the death of 400 Palestinians, most of whom were women and children, that this was only the beginning. It is not right that the ordinary people of Palestine should suffer because of the actions of Hamas. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that we now need to send a stronger message to Israel and go further, perhaps by suspending all arms licences to Israel and by recognising the State of Palestine?
Let me say to the Honourable Judge, we are 3 days into a resumption of fighting. 3 days too long, and I have lamented in my statement and numerous times already in the Chamber the loss of life. But 3 days means that there is more diplomacy that we can deploy to get that ceasefire back, and that is what I intend to do over the coming hours and days.
Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? It's never easy to come to the Chamber and make a statement on something as paraded.
That we can return to a ceasefire. But in the last few days, hundreds of more women and children have been killed in Gaza. We've now had confirmation from the Foreign Secretary that a British national aid worker, UN aid worker, has been wounded, and aid continues to be blocked. The hope for Palestinians is moving far away. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary to further reiterate his commitment around the diplomatic efforts of this government, but also to give us a sense of what the UK government is doing at this moment, where there is such darkness for the Palestinian people, where they think about what may be coming in the coming days, so that we can very quickly not only return to a ceasefire, but a longer-term hope for that region.
The communique, Tom Fletcher. This Israeli with intensity 40.
It's a tragic fact that military out on our that generate
for these people work. It would mass was still. Let's.
Shalami.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This ceasefire provided a glimmer of hope, as the Foreign Secretary mentioned, for the innocent civilians fleeing the constant bombardment, the bloodshed. It provided hope for the innocent hostages waiting desperately to be reunited with their families. And to see Israel breach this is indefensible. The targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure should not be justified under any circumstances. I thank the Foreign Secretary for the work that he's doing and the personal efforts he's leading behind the scenes, including the recent statement with the UK, Germany and French foreign ministers. And as the Foreign Secretary knows, leadership requires that honesty with your friends and telling things how they are. And will the Foreign Secretary commit to the UK showing leadership in providing that international clarity to end this cycle of violence?
Honourable friend, for all.
Aid, cutting electricity essential for drinking water, forced displacement of civilians, and now indiscriminate bombing, killing and maiming. Many electricity. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza, blocking the entry of humanitarian aid, cutting electricity essential for drinking water, forced displacement of civilians, and now indiscriminate bombing, killing and maiming many children. These are not just clear risks of breach of humanitarian law, they are clear breaches, and it's just not enough to say we don't like it. So can I ask the Secretary of State a very specific question? Has he explicitly asked the Israeli government whether any UK-made arms or arms components were used in the mass airstrikes in recent days that broke the ceasefire and have caused untold suffering for civilians?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that in making our assessment on a clear risk of a breach of humanitarian law, we suspended arms sales to Israel. That is what we did, and I stand by that decision.
Paul Wall.
Madam Deputy Speaker, of the 170 children killed in Israel's deadly day of bombing in Gaza on Tuesday, 3 of them were brothers, and they were sons of Karem Tariq Hamid. Hassan, who was 9, Mohammed, aged 8, and Aziz, who was just 5. They used to play around and have fun, their father told the BBC. They wanted to be doctors, teachers. I'm the father of 3 sons too, and it disgusts me that actually Israel's actions seem to somehow treat Palestinian children's lives as somehow more expendable, less precious than Israeli children's lives. So isn't it time we had a diplomatic coalition of the willing maybe starting with the E3 of the UK, France and Germany, to say not just through actions but words, not just words but actions, actually how we're going to call out Israel's appalling crimes in Gaza.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that as the father of an adopted child, I feel personally the plight of the many, many children in Gaza that have been orphaned, the many children that are subject to exploitation as a result that they now have no parents. And it breaks my heart that amongst those who are now injured, who are now bereft, who have lost their parents, that more horrors could have been deployed on them. So I understand the strength of his feeling, and it's why I'm doing all I can with E3 partners particularly to try and halt this behaviour.